You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Hello and welcome to episode 42 of Leading the Factory Forward. I'm Lynn Friest, your host, and thank you for listening. So we're here to help you create a compelling future for yourself, your teams, and your organization. And one of the things we do is we try to listen both to you as well as what are the things that are going on out there in the world that impact you. So right now, for this episode, we're going to talk about what manufacturers need in 2020. And this is the second episode in our series of what's coming in 2020 for manufacturing. I've talked about some of these ideas in earlier podcasts, but I wanted to share some of what I've learned here early in 2020. Again, this is a four-part series. We talked last episode about what are some of the trends that people see for 2020 in terms of manufacturing. And this is going to be looking at, well, what has actually manufacturers said about what they need and what they're working on and what their issues are. And then in a following episode, we'll talk about working with the manufacturing extension partnerships, and I'll explain more about that. And then finally, I'll give you a quick look at a tool that I've used and that was developed in a local area called Tech Playbooks to help you get started in understanding some of these technologies. So for this episode, what is it that you, the actual manufacturing owners and leaders, say that you're looking for, you're trying to improve on, you're hoping could be better? So the sources for that, what I looked at was one, the National Manufacturing Excellence Partnership Survey of Manufacturers' Needs, and they've been doing this survey for over 10 years. And some of the needs have been remarkably consistent, but there are some things that are changing and shifting as we go forward. Second, I'm going to use an Iowa manufacturing survey because I'm located near Iowa. I've seen the survey, and it's a wonderful tool that they have. And then the third piece, we'll look a little at some of the deeper implications of that survey. Again, I'm sure surveys are done throughout the nation in different states, so this is just my piece of how I might be able to try to explain some of this to you. So in this national survey of manufacturing firms, some of these elements have been constant, but some of them have kind of changed over time. The first one has been and consistently is continuous improvement. It's dropped a little bit, but it's still 65% of the firms say this is the key thing they need. How do they improve their operations, improve their costs, make themselves more resilient and faster? The next one that's kind of bumped up in the last few years, and that's called employee recruitment and retention. And again, we've had some conversations around that. But again, that's up to almost 60% now, whereas before people weren't concerned, but this has become a key need. And we've talked about this in some podcasts earlier, and I'll refer you back to them. The third opportunity that they're looking for, 47% of them are actually looking for growth opportunities. They recognize that whoever they're selling to today, they need to find new opportunities to sell to new customers or maybe a wider range of customers. And then the fourth need that they've described is product development and innovation. 40% specified that. So again, this is the kind of idea where they know they need to introduce new products. For some of it, their competition is changing. For some of it, their customers have new needs. Again, with small, medium-sized manufacturers, one of the difficulties is having the time, attention, and just energy to create new products and create new innovations. So again, that remains a challenge. Then finally, interestingly enough, while last episode we talked about the technology that's coming out and how it can impact things, they actually, only about 17% of them say that's a big concern. And I guess I would flip that around and say, well, the fact that only 17% say it's a big concern is a problem too. So we'll see, what can we do about that? Next, we'll move to the Iowa Survey of Manufacturers. And again, the state of Iowa does this every year and have done for some period of time. So they just ask in general, what are the concerns? Now, one that's been common and that we don't normally address in this podcast, but is very critical for manufacturers, rising healthcare costs. And I'm sure you as a manufacturer or a business owner, this is always a concern. So that's actually the number one concern. But then, just as we mentioned earlier on a national level, the inadequate availability of an hourly workforce. They can't get the people needed to make the parts that they're trying to create. And then along with that, there's rising labor costs. And that goes hand in hand with the previous thing, because if you have a shortage of people and inevitably you need to pay people more to get good people. But you're not necessarily going to be able to pass that on to your customers. So rising labor costs are an issue. Then in Iowa, they talked about raw material costs. Again, that would be a concern, I'm sure, for any organization. But again, those things, if your price of raw materials is going up, it certainly affects your ability to compete. Next in Iowa, they talked about the inadequate availability of a salaried or a tech workforce. So not only can they not find the production level employees, but they also can't find the engineers, the other people they might need to help run their business. And I'll say, having talked with some people in Iowa, they say it's not really an issue just of we can't find skilled people. They literally can't find people. There just aren't enough people in the state. And I think we're finding that in more and more states, that it's not just skilled people, but literally you just can't even find people that don't already have jobs and stuff. The next thing for Iowa is, and this probably bleeds back and forth because they're very much an agricultural state, is changes in trade policy. So many of the manufacturers in Iowa support agribusiness and support agriculture in general. So any changes in trade policy can also affect, how the manufacturers are doing. And then once again, technology comes in 8th on the list. So it's one of those things where the manufacturers aren't asking for new technology. They haven't identified that as a critical need of theirs, but it's something they need to keep thinking about. Now, the third area I want to look at is this a kind of a deeper look that the Iowa Survey of Manufacturing took. And this, tries to get a little behind than just a simple survey and says, okay, what's some of the underlying issues here? So the first, they've noted 3 of them. They're workforce, leadership and growth, and then technology and productivity. So in the first one, workforce, what they kind of found as they talked to people and tried to describe what's the path forward was they need to find ways for manufacturers to support employee attraction programs, employee development programs. Earlier, we've talked about apprenticeship programs. So these are the things that manufacturers probably need to have some level of focus on. The other thing they suggested is manufacturers need to improve how they share best practices with one another. Recognize that manufacturers are often in competition, but they maybe have to take a step back. And of course, right now, even if they're not in competition product-wise, they're in competition for people. But again, they probably need to step back and say, how do we have everybody in our community be developing skilled workers so that we can all have them, not just trying to do it on their own? Again, small, medium-sized manufacturers only have so much time, attention, and energy. They really need to work in concert with their community colleges, their high schools, the state-level organizations to work on these issues around workforce. The next piece they talked about was leadership and growth. And again, some of this is not that we don't have great leaders out there. It's how do we do things differently? So right now, some of it is not that we can't manage our business, but we need to help people learn how to implement new capabilities, especially in those firms that have like 20 to 99 employees. Again, they have relatively small leadership teams. They don't have a lot of flexibility as far as how do we train people, how do we create new products, those kinds of things. Along with that, the firms need some help on improving strategy and planning capabilities. Again, we've talked earlier, if you're busy serving your customer, you tend to be reactive, and having another set of eyes or another set of ears, somebody to help you talk through, well, how do we create a strategy to move ahead? And how do we plan for the next year, the things that are coming? And then finally, in this idea of leadership and growth, they felt people needed some help how to build risk management skills. In other words, how do you make your firm more resilient when we have such an uncertain economy out there? So again, small, medium-sized firms, they're fully involved in doing the work that comes at them every day. But how do we provide resources to help them build some skills for resiliency in their business? And then finally, the last thing that they dug deeper in that Iowa survey and found was the whole idea around technology and productivity. Now, on the MEP survey, continuous improvement and productivity were a top concern. And here they just kind of mentioned both those things, both productivity and technology. So again, for the small, medium-sized firms, how can they move from awareness to action as far as Industry 4.0? Again, last episode, we talked about some of the technologies we need to advance, and we'll show you in the 4th episode in this series some of the ideas that you might help you get started as a small and medium-sized firm. But the other thing is, how can technology help actually drive productivity improvements? Now, productivity improvement doesn't require technology, and I'll mention some things, in an earlier podcast where we talked about just looking at the 7 ways to manufacturing or looking at how Toyota develops the continuous improvement processes. Those kinds of things don't necessarily require technology, but technology can really help you do routine things that free up the workforce that you have to do some of these more complex things. So that wraps up the pieces of information I wanted to share. And always, I want to provide you with some first steps that you can take. And I want to refer back to the state of Iowa, that deeper look into their survey of manufacturing. And I want to refer you in this case to some of the earlier work we've talked about in the podcast. So for the workforce piece, I'd refer you back to episode 7 of the podcast, where we talked about 3 ideas for developing new talent. What are the things you could approach that right away could get you started in creating upskilling or reskilling or attracting new talent? The next thing I'd suggest is episode number 34, a fairly recent one, where it talked about how you as a small, medium-sized company can connect with apprenticeship programs in your area to develop people for yourself and just the community in general. The next piece would be continuous improvement. Once again, some earlier podcasts go all the way back to episode 2, where I talked about how do you deal with the 7 wastes of manufacturing. Now, that doesn't require a lot of technology. It just requires some attention, and really you can engage your people in those things fairly easily. In addition, episode 36 is where we talked about Toyota talent principles, using the wealth of information that Toyota has shared with us as to how to work with continuous improvement and improving productivity. Then the idea around growth. So in episode 3, I talked about a book called Run, Improve, Grow. But it was the whole idea in that book was, how do you get your frontline people to run the business for you so that you can step away? How do you get your first line leaders to handle all the improvement activities so that you as the leader in manufacturing can focus on what it takes to grow your business? So that's a nice episode to give you some ideas on how do you get started there. And then episode 21 is about creating your value proposition. So if you're trying to figure out what it is I want to do next year, the following years, think about your customers. What is it they need? How do you go out and talk with them about how do you create value for them? How do you sell value to them? What is the value they're looking for? Then the final thing was the whole technology. And I won't say too much about that now, but I'm going to share this idea in our 4th episode about technology playbooks. These are some online resources that can help you get started in some of these technologies. It won't give you the whole answer, but it'll give you an idea of where to start and how to start thinking about it maybe. So that wraps up this episode. And again, I highly recommend the resources that are in the show notes, as well as these earlier podcast episodes that I mentioned. We're going to be talking about some other general recommendations I would make was visit your state's Manufacturing Extension Partnership website. You can go to the national website. It's hosted by the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. It's part of the Commerce Department, but you can look at the national site and from there navigate to your state's Manufacturing Extension Partnership website. And once you find those, or even at other states, look on those websites because they often have a wonderful wealth of examples of how they have worked with manufacturers and how they've helped small, medium-sized companies do things around the topics we said with workforce or productivity or technology. So again, these are great resources to give you ideas of what's possible out there. And that's what we're going to cover in our 3rd part of this 4-part series. We're going to be talking about working with the manufacturing extension partnerships. And again, I'll be sharing with you examples of what I've done. I have worked with both the one in Illinois called IMEC and the one in Iowa called Cirrus, and we'll talk more about what I've experienced with them and then how you can probably have that same experience at your state. Beyond that, I encourage you to visit my website, download the PDFs at the bottom of the podcast episodes, and use those as tools to capture notes as you start exploring some of the concepts. So again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.